My first year in college, David and I would stay up all night sharing stories from our childhood. So one night we started talking about our B'nai Mitzvah, and I asked him what the theme of his bar mitzvah was. And he said, "Theme? What do you mean?" I said, carnival, baseball, under the sea, Vegas, the theme. Mine was ice cream. And he, without an ounce of irony, looked at me and said, "The theme of my bar mitzvah was Torah." And that sealed it. This nerdy Jew would be the father of my children. So, cut to this past spring, it's Sammy's bat mitzvah. We spent 13 years looking forward to it, and having walked through this moment with so many of you and with your families and with our oldest Eva, we had our priorities straight. The theme of her bat mitzvah would be Torah, with a subtle nod to Star Wars, because it was on May 4th. May the 4th. Yeah, you got me. Thank you. Bring Michaela back. She's a professional. But when the big day finally came, and here I have to be serious, we were holding not only joy and gratitude, but we were also holding real fear and great sadness all in the same heart. Because as you may remember, just 1 week earlier, a white supremacist walked into the Chabad in Poway, not far from here, and shouted, "F the Jews," and shot the place up. This was, for Jews all over the country, a terrifying indication that the massacre at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh 6 months earlier had not happened in isolation, but instead may have been a harbinger of a newer, more violent trend in anti-Semitic hatred in America. So I've now spent the past several months wondering what really is the Torah of this moment. What does it mean to be a Jew in the world today? How do we walk through the world as thoughtful, open-hearted, intellectually curious, spiritually alive human beings when it is, once again, not terribly safe to be a Jew? Sometimes it takes overt hostility from the outside world for us to cast loving eyes on our own Jewish family. After Poway, I felt this desperate need to talk to my kids not only about the dangers of extremism and gun violence and racism and the toxic culture of hatred that is sickening this country, but I wanted also to talk to them about Jewish peoplehood. I felt this need for them to understand that as many Jews dress differently, daven differently, even vote differently, even still, I know in my heart that there's something powerful and perhaps even eternal that binds us to one another. I wanted my kids to understand that on some mystical level, there is a force that stretches invisibly between every Jew, that binds us to one another over the generations, across geographical and ideological boundaries. That's why an attack on any Jewish community feels like an attack on us all. And even still, I have to admit that I struggled to articulate what unites us, beyond the fact that we are hated by the same white nationalist terrorists, or would have been thrown into the same cattle car. So last month, I joined a group of 36 scholars in Jerusalem for a forum that was called Our Common Destiny, convened by President Ruvi Rivlin. It was a diverse group of Israeli and diaspora Jews, rabbis, professors, activists from Tel Aviv and from hilltop settlements, from Los Angeles and Paris, Hong Kong, Buenos Aires, and Budapest. It included, among others, 2 ultra-Orthodox or Haredi settler rabbis and 3 women rabbis. We were brought together in a time of growing polarization and division to determine what, if anything, unites us as a people, and what, if anything, we're willing to do about it. We met with President Rivlin at Beit HaNasi at his home, and I was honored to be asked to address him, probably to many people's chagrin, to represent the voice of American Jewry, to share my perspective. So I said that every time I step off the plane at Ben Gurion Airport, I think about the miraculous birth of the State of Israel. I think about the ingathering of the exiles and the countless acts of heroism, the revitalization of Hebrew as a language and as a culture, the stunning achievements in art and science and medicine and technology. I said that I realized that my great-grandparents could only have dreamed of walking in the streets of Jerusalem and breathing its air. And even as I hold a profound awareness of the miraculous and the remarkable, I must be honest that my heart is heavy when I think about the Jewish state today and when I think about the Jewish people today, because I see growing rifts between religious and secular, between right and left, Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews that are threatening to tear our people apart. And then I went on to address some of those rifts. I spoke about how many American Jews are deeply invested in protecting an endangered democracy here in the United States. And that's why we're so pained to see a right-wing ultranationalist government actively undermining democratic norms in Israel, not to mention increasingly willing to align with extremist and even anti-Semitic regimes abroad. Most American Jews, I shared, root their practice, their Jewish practice, in Torah values of love and justice and a ceaseless striving for peace for our own people and for all people. We know that Israel must exist in the real world and that it faces real threats. But the Jewish state, which calls upon American Jews for support and for partnership, also must persist in striving not only to be a Jewish refuge, but also a reflection of core Jewish values, which also happen to be its own founding values. Meanwhile, Israeli society seems now to be turning a blind eye to overt coercive racism and xenophobia, emerging now not only from the margins, but from the Prime Minister's office and permeating much of the political establishment there. I come from a Jewish community, I shared, that is deeply disturbed by the decoupling of Torah from compassion and decency, that is increasingly anguished not only by a 52-year occupation that denies millions of Palestinians basic civil rights, but also by the hardening of the Jewish heart toward Palestinians, toward foreign workers, toward asylum seekers in Israel. We are pained when people who call themselves religious use our holy text sometimes to justify hatred, insularity, and even violence. Our Jewish community, I said, knows well the external challenges that we face, the ongoing threat of terror and global anti-Semitism. But until now, we have failed to adequately address the growing chasm, both political and psychic, that is tearing our people apart. It serves no one when we stubbornly persist in waving the banner of Jewish identity with the all too often empty promises that it holds. Indeed, it is long past time for us to reckon with these foundational differences in our people. After my talk, one of the Haredi rabbis in the group, a leader of the settlement movement, by many measures my ideological opposite, told me that he was hurt by my words. I asked him if he would be willing to tell me more about what upset him. And then something extraordinary happened. We sat down for lunch together in the hotel restaurant and talked for nearly 3 hours. We talked about the settlement enterprise, which he sees as a great blessing and a miracle from Hashem, and I see as an engine of human rights abuses and a danger to the state of Israel. We spoke about the harsh restrictions on Palestinians, his neighbors, which he sees as necessary for security, and I see as a violation of basic principles of both Torah and democracy. We shared our understanding of the Torah's 36 commandments regarding the treatment of the ger, the stranger, which he believes are a suggestion in the abstract and I believe are the very essence of our religious commitment. We talked about violent Jewish extremism, which he believes exists among other people but not among our own. And to suggest that it does is to slander his community, and which I see as a potentially fatal danger to Israeli democracy and to the Jewish people. And we happen to touch on our feelings about the United States president. I will let you guess where we both stood on that one. I don't want to get too political. The conversation ended with him inviting me to his settlement for Shabbat. I respectfully declined. And me inviting him to come experience Shabbat at Ikar. He respectfully declined. Though this conference was designed to lift up our shared bonds, I left with an even clearer sense than before of what divides us. And the answer to that is nearly everything. And even still, I must admit to you that I walked away with a strange feeling of tenderness toward this man that I could not fully understand. That and a strong sense that in this day and age, the fact that neither of us walked away from that table for 3 hours has got to mean something. One thing that I'm certain that this rabbi and I would agree upon is the fact that anti-Semitism is back and it is on the rise. The shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh last October was the most violent attack in the history, anti-Semitic attack in the history of the United States. Many in this community grew up in that shul. My friend and colleague, Rabbi Jonathan Birkin, did too. His father was the rabbi. And last fall, he shared a little bit of what he was experiencing at the many funerals that he attended in the aftermath of the shooting. He wrote about one woman, Janina, whose father-in-law, Daniel, was among the victims. She was raised Catholic, but she always knew that her ancestors were crypto-Jews because they mysteriously lit candles and they very discreetly avoided eating pork. So as she grew up, she was eager to reclaim her Jewish roots. She studied with Rabbi Birkin for conversion, and she ultimately married a Jewish man whose family was at Tree of Life Synagogue. She had just given birth to her first child when the shooting occurred. Rabbi Birkin described how Janina sobbed in his arms at the graveside and said, "My ancestors suffered in Spain during the Inquisition. When I had my son, I believed he would never suffer like they did. Now look at him. He will grow up without a grandfather." Rabbi Birkin wrote, "When someone chooses Judaism as an adult, the Talmud requires that the rabbi first warn, 'Don't you know that the Jewish people are anguished, despised, and harassed, and hardships are frequently visited upon them?'" He said, 10 years ago in America, I would say this line before a conversion as a kind of joke. It simply did not capture the experience of being Jewish in the United States. But I said it anyway, as an homage to our painful past. "I cannot believe," he wrote, "that in 2018, I now must say that line again in earnest." Pittsburgh and Poway were the most deadly manifestations of this resurgent anti-Semitism, but over the last couple of years, anti-Semitic assaults, attacks, and incidents of vandalism have risen significantly around the world, in particular here in the United States, in France, in Britain, and in Germany. And I'm sorry to be the person to share the news with you if you have not already heard, but just a few hours ago in Germany, there was a shooting at a synagogue, and it looks as though at least a couple of people are killed. The gunmen approached the synagogue shouting that the Jews were the root of all evil. In America, the rise in anti-Semitism mirrors this broader trend. There has been an indisputable rise in hate crimes related to race and ethnicity, to religion and sexuality over the course of the past 3 years. So we must consider anti-Semitism in the context of racialized hatred that today is tearing our nation apart, while acknowledging, as Eric Ward reminds us, that anti-Semitism does not function quite like any other form of oppression and hatred. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory that makes us, the Jews, the greatest threat to the human family. Read Deborah Lipstadt. Anti-Semitism today is rooted in the notion that Jews control the banks and the media, that we are cheap and we are rich, we are capitalists and we're communists, we are nationalists and we're globalists. We are dually loyal and disloyal all at once. And now we're shifty too, as in shifty Schiff. Anti-Semitism is a pervasive and viral form of hatred that lives on the left and on the right, among the rich and the poor, the educated and the ignorant, in blue states and in red states. And it is important for us to know and recognize that anti-Semitism anywhere is a threat to Jews everywhere. And at the same time, it is important that we are very clear. The people who have engaged in murderous acts of violence against Jews in this country are all right-wing white nationalist terrorists whose goal is nothing short of the total eradication of Jews and people of color from our country. These white nationalists abide a particular brand of anti-Semitism that was honed over the centuries in Europe and has now successfully migrated to the United States. It is a right-wing nationalistic anti-Semitism in which the Jews, the ultimate outsiders, conspire to commit white genocide by undermining systems of white power through funding and supporting movements for social change. Over the past 3 years, America has turned from a place with a constant but quiet undercurrent of this kind of anti-Semitism to a place in which anti-Semitism is fed, fueled, and funded from the highest offices in the country. The Pittsburgh shooter wrote just before charging into that synagogue that he believed that Jews were responsible for bringing third world caravans of approaching invaders to our borders. This language was inspired directly from the President of the United States Twitter feed. Accusations of globalists manipulating the economy and cheating American workers have permeated the consciousness of a generation of angry, disaffected white men who are looking for a scapegoat and have found one. Just days ago, the president's son attacked the Jewish chair of the House Intelligence Committee as, quote, handpicked and supported by George Soros. We all know where this kind of rhetoric leads. At the same time, we must be vigilant to all manifestations of anti-Semitism, even from our allies and from our friends. As Rabbi Jill Jacobs writes, anti-Semitism in America today increasingly masquerades as criticism of Israel. Criticism of Israel, of course, is not necessarily anti-Semitic, but Israel's critics often, whether through ignorance or through hatred, slide seamlessly from criticism of the policies of the State of Israel into criticism of us, the Jewish people. We've now reached a point at which, as Jill Jacobs writes, Jews increasingly feel unwelcome on the left unless they abandon their commitments to Israel altogether. I have also personally experienced an alarming and concerning lack of sensitivity to Jewish history and to the experience of Jewish suffering, even among some leaders of the movements for racial and economic and gender justice. It is not uncommon to hear voices from the left playing with the same anti-Semitic language and tropes as their ideological foes from the right. Critically, many of them downplay Jewish vulnerability, failing to understand the peculiar trajectory of Jewish trauma. Historically, it is from even positions of great power and privilege and security that catastrophe has come to our people abruptly and without warning. This year, when we read Megillat Esther, the story of Purim, I was most taken by one detail in the text that I had never noticed before. The villain, Haman, is in great distress over the fact that Mordecai, the Jew, refused to honor him by bowing down before him. So he approaches King Ahasuerus to ask for permission to kill not only Mordecai, but all of the Jews, because then, like now, one Jew represents to the anti-Semite all Jews. So he tells the king that he's so determined to kill the Jews that he's willing to pay for it. 10,000 talents of silver. I have to imagine that was a lot of money back then. But the king, rather than take Haman's money, says, you know what? Go ahead and do it for free. We don't know exactly what King Ahasuerus' relationship was like with the Jews before this. We know that there were Jews in his court. We know there were Jews among his judges and officials, maybe even his friends. But why would he agree to Haman's plot to kill all of those innocent people in his kingdom? The rabbis answer that Achashverosh himself harbored resentment toward the Jews. His hatred was more subterranean. It was kind of a more passive racism. But when given the opportunity, he was delighted that Haman had similar aspirations and was willing to do the job for him. In other words, Haman's hatred for Mordechai and for the Jewish people alone was not sufficient to create the conditions for genocide. But his overt anti-Semitism met up with a more subtle hatred, and when given the opportunity to erupt, together they erupted. As Megillat Esther reinforces, anti-Semitism unchecked penetrates all aspects of a society. If it is not honestly and openly addressed, it, like any viral infection, will fester beneath the surface until it's given permission to emerge dangerously into the light of day. I know that these are scary times, especially after this latest attack on Yom Kippur Day. But we must not be driven by fear. In the book of Numbers, the Israelite people are blessed by the Gentile prophet Bilam as Am Levadad Yishkon, a people that dwells apart, not reckoned among the nations. This notion has become critical to our self-definition and identity over the years, and to many seems like a reflection of an eternal truth. We stand in isolation from the world as much as we try to assimilate or at least integrate into the dominant cultures in which we live. We are constantly reminded that we are different and we will never be fully accepted. To be clear, this self-understanding has grown out of years of collective trauma. The lesson of our history is clear. We can trust no one. No one will defend us. We must defend ourselves. On some level, constant vigilance paired with the sense that we must go it alone, this has been the survival mechanism for our people through many difficult chapters of history. But sadly, in its extreme, the Am Levadad Yishkon mentality has become an empathy blocker when it comes to those outside our Jewish community. With this worldview, compassion is at best seen as a sign of weakness. At worst, it is an act of treason. The message, our people has been through hell. We have every justification now to do whatever we need to do to gain the strategic advantage, even if it violates core Jewish values and long-standing norms, even if it means alienating our allies and our friends, even if it means partnering with known bigots and even anti-Semites, like the two white evangelical pastors who were paraded into the new embassy in Jerusalem to offer their blessing. One of them had preached that Jews will suffer for all eternity in hell. The other preached that Hitler was an agent of God, fulfilling a biblical prophecy against the Jews. But as a people misunderstood and detested by all the world over, the thinking goes, we must cast our lot with whomever is willing to shower favor upon us. Of course, there is another way to live as a Jew in the world. There's another Jewish mentality. It's also rooted in trauma. But this camp works to define itself not by its victimhood, but by its values. It's rooted in a lo tov heyot adam levado mentality. From the creation story in Genesis, it is not good for a person to be alone. This Jewish mindset is grounded in compassion and empathy, and it responds to Jewish suffering by deepening relationships with others who are also similarly suffering. This mentality rejects the false binary of universalist or particularist. Instead, this kind of Jew insists on holding both. It is precisely her particular connection to Jewish history and Jewish tradition that forms the foundation of her universalistic commitments. Let me say that again. It is precisely our particular connection to Jewish history and Jewish tradition that forms the foundation of our universalistic commitments. So are we, at the end of the day, a nation alone in a raging sea of hatred, eternal outsiders understood by no one and suspicious of everyone? Or do we see ourselves as part of a precious and fragile web of humanity, linked by both shared interests and a common destiny? Because the answer to that question may lie at the heart of my disagreement with the rabbi in Jerusalem, and so much of the schism that is tearing apart the Jewish people. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, Abraham Joshua Heschel declared that this is the foundational and eternal question for the Jews. And it's clear where he stood. None of us can do it alone, he said. Our era marks the end of self-reliance. We share the perils and the fears. We stand on the brink of the abyss together. No religion is an island. We are all involved with one another. The fact is, of course, there are good people all over the world who are horrified by the rise in anti-Semitic hatred and violence, who stand with us in solidarity and who have held us in our most vulnerable hours with love. Like one of my Muslim friends here in Los Angeles who texted me only hours after one of the synagogue attacks this past year and said, I am right here by your side. I will do whatever you need. I will stand in front of Ikar to protect your community next Shabbat if you would like for me to do that. And one of my pastor friends who wrote to me, I am so sorry for what hate has done in our midst. I don't have adequate words, and yet I will not be silent. Whatever I can do to eradicate anti-Semitism, I will do that. I stand with you. And so many more. That indicates to me that yes, we are different, but we are not alone, and we are not apart. There are so many good people in the world. They are our partners and our allies and our friends. They stand on the same side of history that we do. And they care deeply about our safety, even as they worry for their own. It is critical that we remember that we are not the only people experiencing profound vulnerability right now. The shooting in Poway was 1 week after 250 people, including 45 kids, were killed in an ISIS attack on churches in Sri Lanka. And only a few days after the horrific massacre at the mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, by a white nationalist who happened to have been inspired by the Pittsburgh shooting. 2 months after Poway suicide bombers blew up a Catholic mass in the Philippines, and the terror attack at Zion Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, and the Sikh temple in Oak Creek, these are still fresh in our memory. The fact is that good people everywhere feel under attack amid a broader cultural trend of hatred and the demonization of minority communities. Extremist violence threatens not only Jews, but also Muslims and Latinos and Blacks and LGBTQ folks and immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers. These attacks happen not only at our synagogues, but in our churches and mosques and schools and Walmarts. They are not only destroying people's lives, they are threatening to undermine our democracy and to unravel the entire social fabric. So as much as I sometimes feel as a Jew deeply misunderstood and even scared, I know that we gain nothing by further isolating ourselves. Instead, even when we are fearful and anguished, like I am today, we need to stand up together to deepen the bonds of connectedness. As much as there is now a globally networked community of hate on social media, we are called to build globally networked communities of love. We need our allies. We need our friends by our side, and we must also stand by theirs, arm in arm, side by side, reclaiming through our tears and through our conviction an ethic that treats every single one of us with love, respect, and dignity. So I flew to Jerusalem to see what unites the Jews. And I came back with a deeper awareness of what divides us. But after a really challenging year, I want to offer you two stories to close that give me some sense of where the meaning might be found for us nevertheless. 2 months ago, an 18-year-old Israeli Jew named Dvir Sorek was stabbed to death in a terror attack in the West Bank. He was raised in a settlement of Ofra, and he studied in yeshiva in Gush Etzion. He was killed on his way back from Jerusalem, where he bought end-of-year gifts for his rabbis. Those gifts were still in his arms when his body was found. They were copies of David Grossman's new book. This revelation surprised many people because Grossman, one of the great moral voices of Israel, has for many years been an outspoken opponent of the occupation and of the settlement enterprise. So his work seemed like an unlikely choice for Sorek, a young settler, to be reading, let alone sharing with his rabbis in their West Bank yeshiva. When he heard about the murder, Grossman reached out to the young man's grieving parents. He told them that he heard that their son was a kind, sensitive youth who loved others and loved peace. He had heard that this young man had the soul of an artist. And then Grossman said, "I say from experience that this is the start of a very long and difficult road for you." And Grossman knows because he lost his own son Uri in the final days of the Second Lebanon War, 2 days after he stood with Amos Oz and Aleph Bet Yoshua to call upon the conscience of the nation and to plead for an end to the war. Grossman said, "The image of this boy hugging my book breaks my heart." And it is a heartbreaking image. Dvir Sorek, an Orthodox yeshiva student from the settlements, reading David Grossman. Maybe it helped him understand someone very different from himself. Maybe it helped him better understand himself. Grossman writes that when someone sees our humanity, it allows us to become complex, multi-layered beings. Ironically, because of Sorek's willingness to see Grossman's humanity, he himself is now remembered as a more complex, multi-layered being. Zichrono livracha, his memory should be a blessing. And a final story from my friend Sarah Tuttle Singer, who is a brilliant writer in Israel, about a recent encounter that she had with an Arab taxi driver. It's evening, and the driver is laughing, she writes. "What?" I ask, my one earbud still in my ears while I listen to Red Hot Chili Peppers. "That guy, Menachem," he points to the driver of the taxi next to us. "He makes me laugh." The driver rolls down his window. "Shalom, ma koreh? How are you?" he shouts in Hebrew, his K hard and his O guttural. Menachem in the other taxi rolls down his window, and he waves back, "Kif halak," he replies in Arabic as he adjusts his black yarmulke. We drive off. Do all the drivers know each other, I ask? Of course, we are family. We all look out for each other even when we don't agree on anything. When Menachem's wife died, I came for Shiva, and we break the fast together at least once every Ramadan. Wow, that's great, Sarah says. It's just reality, the driver says. We have to be gentle with each other. At the end of the day, everyone just wants to get home. All of the violence of these past few years has shattered our sense of safety. But I wonder now if the Torah of our time is to break out of the smallness of this moment and to remember to look out for one another, to stretch to see each other as the complex, multi-layered beings that we all are, to be gentle and tender with one another. Because at the end of the day, everyone just wants to get home. Gamar Chatima Tova. May it be a year of blessings. Shana Tova.